your ear.
No, he didn't. I swear to God, Justin did not help me cheat.
That's very good. Sorry, I was
okay.
distracted.
I'm sure.
Rule of thumb for journalists. Rule of thumb for journalists when it comes to reporting in general, perhaps COVID specifically. This from Holman Jenkins at the Wall Street Journal. When you find yourself trying to peddle emotion, stop. When you catch yourself selecting facts and claims and metaphors for their sentimental wallop rather than intellectual merit, rethink. The public needs information and context, not help milking its tear ducts. He's offering those rules of the road, if you will, for journalists because of an NPR report that marked another grim milestone. Rachel, each of these terrible new milestones is so big they can start to feel incomprehensible. So I've been struggling to find a way to put such a terrible tragedy into some kind of context. It's hard, but 250,000 deaths is about 5 times the number of U.S. troops killed in combat in Vietnam. It's nearly 5 times the number of Americans who died in combat in World War I. Jenkins writes, those words were spoken with the dramatic intonation that NPR apparently now requires of its on-air performers, indicating not informational content, but somebody's idea of an appropriate emotional response to be extorted from listeners. And yet the question that started the discussion could have been answered in another way, more befitting a news organization. 250,000 deaths is 9% more than the estimated U.S. death toll from the 1957 flu, adjusted for population. It's 34% larger than the 1968 flu's death toll. It's about 1/5 of the 1918 pandemics. Jenkins writes, at least our reporter didn't tell us that laying the victims end-to-end would reach from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Right. It's not like heart disease, which kills an estimated 655,000 Americans a year and will likely continue doing so for the foreseeable future. Why not educate your audience? Holman Jenkins asks, somewhat rhetorically, but he does it anyway. It begins with natural selection. Unknown millions of virus types exist in the world. The number of individual viruses believed to be 10 times the number of biological cells. A liter of seawater contains about 10 billion viruses. Viruses are a major driver, perhaps the key driver, of genetic ferment in the biosphere. Some 20 to 40% of all bacterial cells in the ocean die from viral infection each day. We wouldn't be here without this giant, complicated mixmaster. It's a tragedy for humanity when a new deadly virus comes into the world, leaving a noticeable imprint on the mortality tables, accounting for 9% of all U.S. deaths this year. Unlike car accidents and opioid overdoses, however, COVID deaths are likely to be much reduced next year. Human immune systems will adapt. Vaccines will be deployed. We get invaluable help, which our ancestors never received, from science to endure this new threat from nature as we continue the activities necessary for human survival and advancement. The idea that going from COVID deaths of 24999 to 25000 is a milestone is the hoariest kind of fake news, writes Jenkins. And isn't it, though? For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by our friend and award-winning investigative journalist, Sharyl Attkisson. Sharyl, thanks so much for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Good to join you.
So what about that? I love the Jenkins, rules of the road for journalists. It actually calls to mind, and it was noted on his passing, Jim Lair's 20 rules that he had for how he conducts himself as a journalist, and it basically comported with what Jenkins writes here. If you're trying to peddle emotion, if you're trying to select facts to elicit an emotional response from your audience rather than provide context and consequence, then just stop it.
Well, and I think that's absolutely correct. But I think there's more to it. And this is really what my new book, Slanted, takes a look at. What it's all about is why this information landscape has changed so much and been transformed from, I think, what we used to think of as journalism and how it was practiced to this almost unrecognizable place where reporters seem to think it's their job now to make you feel a certain way, preferably in their view, feel how they do or their corporate and political interests feel about a certain topic. And I think even what's worse, we've seen the idea embraced by many people that now these third parties, political and corporate interests, are supposed to get between us and our information, make sure we don't see certain things, certain scientific studies, certain views that they've decided are wrong, particularly because they cut against their interest, their money interest. But that's what's behind it. But we're told that they're just fact-checking for us, or they're just curating our information. And I think this is a really dangerous place where journalism is today, and it's bled over these narratives and special interests that have largely started to control the news, have bled over into big tech and social media because they understood people were still getting their unfettered access to information online and weren't being controlled. So that had to be stopped. And I think that's the stage we've moved into now.
But you know, a lot of people watch cable news still, and I felt like media bias is exacerbated by the Trump's presidency. And why is that? Is it because he tried to kick reporters out of the room? Well, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
President Trump was viewed by powerful interests as uniquely dangerous as an outsider. So the money trains that they had set up, both Democrats, Republicans, and corporations, to influence politics and everything that happened meant very little once Trump was get elected. It shook up everything. So these narratives and these interests got busy, the ones who pull strings, the smear industry, as I call it, crisis PR firms, nonprofits, LLCs, political action committees, the same ones that pull strings and get their talking points put on the news. They thought this was a terrible development. They got busy trying to controversialize this president, make sure he could get as little done as possible. And the news invited, as I described in Slanted, the news embraced it and invited themselves to be used as narrative machines by inviting these political and corporate interests into our newsrooms. Now they are us. These same people that used to influence us, they're employed as reporters and editors and executives in newsrooms. So if you understand news today redefined in this climate, not as getting at the truth, but making sure we don't see the full truth, then you can understand why they do what they do and why they're rewarded for it, even when they're wrong, when the reporting is bad and false, but nobody's really held accountable. It's because that's exactly what they wanted to do, was get across a particular narrative, true or not, usually not true or at least skewed. And that's the goal now, not making sure you don't get all of the facts and all sides.
You referenced this dangerous place that we're in, and I want to get your viewpoint on where you think this is going. And I highlight a couple of things to build on what you were saying. Bob Epstein, the Harvard-trained psychologist on Tucker Carlson's show the other night, saying, this is somebody who's been researching Google for a long time in terms of their ability to manipulate information and thus influence votes. He looked at it in 2016. He looked at it in 2020. Said Google moved at a minimum of 6 million votes in the 2020 election based on his research through their manipulation of search algorithms. Report out that Facebook also altered a prioritization score to downgrade outlets like Breitbart and upgrade outlets like CNN in the closing days of the election so that people would get the information that Facebook wanted people to get in their news feeds. There's that, and then there's the response even from the quote-unquote mainstream journalistic D.C. press corps community. Like this, the response you had from the Politico reporter who apologized to Twitter for retweeting that New York Post piece about Hunter Biden, saying, I wasn't trying to advance the story. I was just trying to highlight the infirmities with the story, and I apologize for retweeting something that you had taken down, and because his account got suspended for retweeting it. So, those sort of complementary examples tell us that we're going down what path when it comes to a free press, frankly.
Well, we've been going down this dangerous path, and I interviewed an executive from a national news organization who said to me this fear of being deplatformed. So even those who want to tell the truth, who aren't aboard with these corporate and political narratives, they're bullied and they're actually coerced into self-censorship. He said that the newsman in me wants to tell the truth about certain stories, but what sort of Pyrrhic victory would that be if I'm then deplatformed and can't have any voice at all? So he said, I pull my punches. Now think about that. This is a major national news organization that's admitting they don't put certain things out for fear of these organized mob attacks and controversialization of him and his authors and the platform that happens when you go off the narrative they want you to be. And this is being effective in impacting what we get to see in the final product on news. So I think that there will be an outgrowth, I hope, of alternative platforms. I know there are people, smart people and technical people trying to think of ways where independent information can be presented in various views and scientific studies in a way that you cannot be deplatformed and censored and taken down because you've simply expressed an opinion or given a view or put out information, true or not. Guess what? You have a right to put out information that may not be true. And the arbiters that are appointing themselves censors, oftentimes news organizations, have been famously wrong about so many things. For them to try to pretend they're the ones that are going to tell us what's true and what's not, particularly when we don't yet know and something's developing, is actually silly. And yet that accomplishes the goal of making sure we don't see certain information.
It's so interesting because that sort of explanation reminds me of the I pull punches, I have sacred cows, because I have to protect my access to, newsmakers and people who are influential.
Right.
So I'm not going to be a real journalist for some people because I need my access to them. And it's remarkable to me that journalists don't understand, number one, that they're being useful idiots. Number two is that as soon as they outlive their utility, then they'll be cast aside whether or not whether or not they protected those institutions or those sources for a period of time or not.
Well, if news organizations have the will to stand strong and weren't conflicted by these interests and influences, they have the power. We have the power. And I used to argue the same point I talked about in my last book, that, like you said, there will be beat reporters who say, I have to stay in good with the State Department or the White House or the FDA, or I won't get access to the next big interview or to the next big scoop. Well, guess what? They're not telling you anything that is a big scoop. They're not giving you news. They're giving you propaganda that they want put out. They're not giving you other stuff. So you're not going to be harmed if they cut you off. And a recognition of that would enable them to have the power to just report honestly and fairly. And if everybody did that, they'd have no control over the news by denying access to the next handout interview or piece of propaganda that they want people to have. But everybody plays the game, and so it turns out to be quite effective.
She is Sharyl Attkisson, investigative journalist, Emmy Award-winning host of Full Measure. Her new book, which was just released this week, yesterday, I think, Slanted, How the News Media Taught Us to Love Censorship and Hate Journalism. You want to pick that up. Sharyl, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it. Good luck with the book.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs. Restaurant workers losing jobs just before Thanksgiving. $17 million data breach settlement for Home Depot. Those stories next. You've all probably heard of asbestos and know that it's dangerous. And you may also know exposure to asbestos is the only known cause of mesothelioma, a deadly cancer. People who were exposed to asbestos decades ago are being diagnosed to this day with mesothelioma. That's because it can take as many as 30 or even 50 years to develop. But did you also know there's money to pay victims of asbestos exposure from years ago? An estimated $30 billion available to help compensate victims and their families. If you or a member of your family have been diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be able to receive some of this money without ever going to court or filing a lawsuit. Get a free legal review today. Call Sokolov Law at 800-910-1950. That's 800-910-1950. Radical Democrats throwing restaurant workers and bartenders out of work again just before Thanksgiving. Governors and mayors ordering restaurants closed, supposedly because of the China virus pandemic. One owner in Minnesota